Mic check, 1 2. Mic check, 1 2. Can I get a response in the live chat on the mic check, 1 2? How do I sound? Crystal clear. Amazing. I've got noise reduction going, and I think noise reduction is part of why my CPU is going off. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to switch over to the presentation, which means I'm probably going to lose sight of most of what's going on in Discord. So if at all possible, I'm going to rely on Varsity Book Burner to perhaps direct people in Discord, if possible, towards the YouTube stream. If people show up in the Discord. Other than that, I'm just going to continue with the presentation. I don't think we have a lot of people tuning in live, so hopefully people will catch it on the recording, and we'll go from there. But as soon as I flip away from this, I'm basically in presentation mode, and that's about all I'm going to see. So we're going to go with that, and yeah, okay, so I know, yeah, Varsity went to listening, that's fine. Okay, so let's flip over and try and do this presentation here. Okay, I got a thumbs up from Varsity. Sounds good. Okay, first, as a complete introduction, this is a video on the foundations of anti-philosophy. I am Dr. Carl, the Destiny Marks, a PhD. That means basically that I have a doctorate degree in anti-philosophy. Take that for what it's worth. All things rooted in philosophy, including science and anti-philosophy itself, are philosophistry. If you come to tonight's event looking for a logical argument to avoid falling into a pit of fallaciousness, you've come to the wrong place. To reason is to engage in fallacious thought as much as it is to engage in logical thought. As anti-philosophers, we are not opposed to reason. We merely do not require it to reveal our truth to the world of man, and more importantly, we realize it is wholly unnecessary for the world to reveal its truths to us. Mankind has existed for too long with the crutch of philosophy at his side. He has forgotten how to bear the pain to strengthen the bone. To begin understanding anti-philosophy, we must endeavor to understand philosophy. What is philosophy? What does it mean to be a philosopher? Just kidding. Let me be clear. We as anti-philosophers do not need to shy away from such questions, but we question the validity of any method which would aim to answer such questions by mere proposition of them. Instead, we seek an alternative path. Our method, unlike the philosopher, aims to discover such answers through a movement of practical elucidation. We do not ask, what does it mean to be a philosopher? We let the philosophers show us what it means, and we interact accordingly. With that said, a lecture of this sort's being most incapable medium for such, we'll resolve to starting more simply with education and criticism. So for this event, we'll be breaking down and examining anti-philosophy in 3 distinct parts. Namely, we'll be covering the history of anti-philosophy, the tools of the anti-philosopher, and the active state. So let's dive right in and begin with the history of anti-philosophy. Until several weeks ago, when this movement officially recognized itself, the concept of anti-philosophy was primarily constrained to the domain of philosophy itself. Philosophers, disheartened with some of the minds that they gave birth to, began categorizing certain actors among them as anti-philosophical. We have come to free this phrase from their grip and put it in its rightful place. Do not be mistaken. While there have undoubtedly been anti-philosophers as long as there have been philosophers, we should reject these popular examples for what they plainly are. While Comrade Bookburner has already made great strides in addressing the anti-philosopher as philosopher, it is equally important for us to address the philosopher as anti-philosopher. Examples of so-called anti-philosophers range depending on the philosopher you're speaking with, but the most common among them are Epicurus, Nietzsche's Qi, who I believe is Chinese, and Wittgenstein. As we learned in the previous event on the dangers of philosophy, this form of citation, often called name-dropping, is a tool frequently employed by the philosopher to produce a sense of euphoria for themselves. Ergo, when philosophers take to speaking about particular quote-unquote anti-philosophers, what they're actually engaging in is a form of pseudo-introspective masturbation, a mere form of unconscious self-gratification. The real anti-philosophy, as a conscious movement, by contrast, is a fully modern phenomenon. Despite this significant distinction, we cannot simply ignore the philosophical world. After all, the root of anti-philosophy, in principio, is of course philosophy itself, without which anti-philosophy could not have arisen. Anthropologists like Alfred Mason of the UK Institute for Fighting Historical Negligence have proven philosophy began tens of thousands of years ago, as soon as man developed their basic capacities to make shit up. Similar to fictional oral tradition, philosophy began innocently enough as a way to imagine and provoke people into moving beyond what was merely in front of their face. It was not merely a way to pose a question, it was also a way to engage people in the discovery of answers, a tool to squander the perishable surpluses of society not yet steeped in notions of individual wealth. By the days of our ancient Greek friends, philosophy had become a privileged pastime, wrought with political and economic preconditions. This trend continues into medieval periods, with the dominance of the field by religious institutions, until ultimately a revolution begins brewing. Just as the necessity of political economic liberalization begins to take foot, so too does the liberalization of philosophy. Here we find the first proto-anti-philosophers. Still able to perceive the last vestiges of value in their tradition, they created something new, which they called natural philosophy. Today we know this as science, or more simply, how we actually discover things about the world. However important this development was at the time, the field was plagued from the beginning with its philosophical attachments, never fully capable of shedding its lanugo. Even still, what began as relatively defenseless child against the full weight of religio-philosophical industrial complex grew up. These natural philosophers had inadvertently created a monster, which began to challenge the control of more traditional philosophy in subtle but important ways. Where at first there was interest in the conflict that could be carried out between religion and science, it quickly became apparent that philosophy had more likely braided the rope it was going to hang itself with. After Darwin and the development of non-postmodernist paleo-Marxism, the promise was all but a dream. The branch which was to escort philosophy into the modern world had essentially reduced it to rubble. Not content with giving up the ghost, a number of sympathetic English and German types began attempting to resurrect the ill-fated discipline. By the turn of the 20th century, a new breed of secular or even atheistic philosophers, sympathetic to both sides, began to take action. The aforementioned Wittgenstein begins to engage in a systematic campaign to save philosophy. It is asserted, while philosophy may actually be rubbish for investigating reality, it provides us with something else. This quote-unquote something else would later come to be referred to by most as a therapeutic value. To avoid the sense of desperation, this therapeutic value was then projected post hoc onto earlier philosophers like Epicurus and Nietzsche's Qi. Stated more plainly and without the jargon, therapeutic value can be reduced thusly. Having sufficient mastery of semantics to make you feel like you understand shit, such that you don't kill yourself. Unlike Epicurus, there's some evidence that our 19th century Chinese friend actually believed in this. Having never sufficiently mastered semantics, however, he was relegated instead to basically arguing that we actually should just kill ourselves. Wanting to have their cake and eat it too, philosophers invented the tendency of anti-philosophy, And rather than any serious hope of anti-philosophy, the heights of this tendency appear only in their most developed stages as an antidepressant. We practice philosophy not to discover truth, but to give us a pill that makes us feel as though we have discovered it in light of the complete ineptitude of the tool. A true anti-philosophical movement, however, could then only arise in these final moments. Over half a century since Wittgenstein's death, the world has now suffered through several decades of philosophy in its final and most absolute form. What can only be described as total fucking nonsense. TFN for short. This is not to say that contemporary philosophers do not engage in older modes of philosophy. They of course do. It is, however, to say that philosophy has reached a point of decadence so great that it has become an increasing existential threat to humanity. Philosophy exists for philosophy's sake. Philosophers for the sake of philosophers. Left unattended and sufficiently unchallenged, philosophy seeks to subsume human experience into its own web of contradictions. Movies, music, politics, and yet to this day, nature itself are all fair game for the philosopher. As any quick drive down to your local Amazon library will demonstrate, there are books on everything from the philosophy of your favorite movie to a book explaining why cleaning your room might make you feel better. Anti-philosophy, the real anti-philosophy of today, could not have been born, and could not have been born at any other time. Lastly, I hear what you're all asking yourselves. Isn't this just some form of pragmatism with an absurdist aesthetic? The answer is no. Pragmatism is a form of philosophy. Absurdism is a form of art. This is anti-philosophy. For us, anti-philosophy is not a state of being which is to be established, a reality to which we will have to adjust ourselves. We call anti-philosophy the real movement which abolishes the present ideals of people. The conditions of this movement result from the premises now in existence. With that said, we're going to move on to the tools of the anti-philosopher. The tools of the anti-philosopher are organically crafted from the finest ingredients to engage with philosophy in a direct opposition. Until now, so-called anti-philosophers or philosophers themselves have only employed the tools of philosophy in opposition to itself, i.e., in indirect opposition. But this is precisely what philosophy is in its highest form. This is not to say that we cannot use philosophers' tools. It is merely to say that the philosopher's tools alone are insufficient, and without care, we're just as likely to forward philosophical engagement as we are to stand in its way. What is needed instead is a set of tools which can be employed in the active abolition of philosophy. Stated in another way, the moment you see someone engaging in philosophy, these tools can be employed to neutralize it and prevent it from spreading. This doesn't regard the morality of such use, and we won't do that here. Legally, however, know that the Anti-Philosophy Coalition does not condone violence. Here we will examine the three primary tools and their philosophical correlates. The first tool is absurdity and incoherence. Up is down, down is up. When philosophers appeal to jargon, to obfuscate, or attempt to equivocate, you can employ absurdity and incoherence to counter them. Satire and parody. Philosophers demonstrate their love of their own knowledge through citation. Anti-philosophers employ satire and parody to show our love for their ignorance. Stones and flowers. When ideas fail, brute force is often the difference between success and failure. Appreciate the real world as a tool for winning the battle of ideas. It has flowers too. Let's review these in greater detail, starting with absurdity versus jargon. Jargon is the correlate to absurdity. Absurdity is not distinctly different from jargon. It's also important to distinguish that jargon doesn't necessitate using obscure language. Colloquial language can also be obscure if its meaning is ambiguous. That is, if our philosopher is equivocating. The primary distinction between absurdity and jargon is when the anti-philosopher employs absurdity, they do not actually believe what they're saying makes any sense. While jargon, on the other hand, will often also not make any sense, see total fucking nonsense, the philosopher always believes that their jargon or employment of jargon makes sense. Here's an example. In this example from our own Discord, you can see where someone entered into the chat, attempted to make an argument by asserting, in response to my claim that this server aims to build a praxis to negate philosophy, that we're not negating philosophy. Of course, this doesn't make any sense with what I said, because what I said was the server aims to build a praxis to negate philosophy. I never claimed that the server was negating philosophy. Of course, he felt that this was necessary to do, and then he spoke of quote-unquote versions of philosophy, some of which apparently we would find more emotionally appealing. In response, I responded with absurdity. With respect to the version of philosophy that we use, we began on 17.2, but found it was insufficiently diminutive. Ostensibly, if the ontology of philosophy is going to cohere with the general epistemological presuppositions of our materialist outlook, then we're probably going to need to go into the 3.x releases. I spent most of the weekend trying to install it, but I couldn't get it to work. Asking whether or not this addressed this person's concerns, they responded, "We're doing philosophy right now." This, of course, is a total victory. Within seconds, perhaps minutes at most, this person left the server, deleted all their previous messages. Thankfully, I was able to capture this in a screenshot. Philosophy was immediately defeated in this context, and the person admitted essentially that the complete absurdism and gibberish that was just pronounced was doing philosophy, quote unquote. Of course, philosophers will often try to combat absurdity by agreeing with you. If you tell them what you just said was something you completely made up and is intended to be incoherent, they'll often try to flat or gaslight you by explaining how what you actually just said has a kernel of truth and should be explored further. Don't fall for this. The second tool of anti-philosophers is satire, also paired with parody. Satire is a way to combat citation, regardless of the form. With this tool, the anti-philosopher can construct famous quotes by real-ish people, making up events and or holding positions they don't actually hold. So long as product is contextualized and grounded sufficiently in reality, it can be used to buttress the anti-philosophical position. In this particular example, we're going to address two distinct quotes here. One, from this presentation itself, where previously I stated, anthropologists like Alfred Mason of the UK Institute for Fighting Historical Negligence have proven philosophy began tens of thousands of years ago as soon as man developed their basic capacities to make shit up. Of course, this quote in and of itself, the person, the institute, are all made up. Similarly, we can actually see the same counter citation in something like The Abolition of Work by social philosopher Bob Black, where he says the anthropologist Marshall Solins, surveying the data on contemporary hunter-gatherers, exploded the Hobbesian myth in an article entitled The Original Affluent Society. They work a lot less than we do, and their work is hard to distinguish from what we would regard as play. Of course, both of these are extremely absolutist statements. Both of them are not really supported by the work that they cite, and both of them are by and large completely antithetical to the nature and the spirit of the work that they cite. Just as the philosopher will often cite many things in rapid succession, also called a Gish gallop, so that you can't verify the validity of what they're saying. So that you can't verify the validity of what they're saying is even to be found within the cited work. Anti-philosophers can also use a similar tactic, if and when confronted on the legitimacy of their claims. That is, essentially, make up or parody a number of citations until the person gives up. Lastly, let's address stones versus ideas. This is the final tool of the philosopher, and it's the final tool for a reason. When the anti-philosopher wields a stone, it should not be mistaken as a simple case of might equals right. Likewise, it should not be taken as a statement about the superiority of any particular metaphysical philosophy. That would be gross. Instead, stones, like the previous tools of absurdity and satire, are just that, a tool with which we combat an active philosophical threat. In this regard, I have been informed by our lawyers that we must state the following. Stones should only be used in cases of existential self-defense, and we do not condone violence as a movement. What we can assure you, however, is that in the battle of ideas, stones always win. There is assuredly no better way to put an idea to rest than with a stone. As an example of this, we could show you a picture of someone who was defeated by stones. Unfortunately, with the lawyers, we had to blur this image out. It was just simply too graphic to display on a public channel. But you can probably imagine what it looks like for someone to be defeated by stones. Alternatively, we have here an example of someone defeated by ideas. As you can see, this person is clearly dejected and depressed. However, they're still alive. They're still able to produce their own ideas and reproduce the contradictions of philosophy. This is why stones defeat ideas. Lastly, we're going to turn to the active state. The active state of anti-philosophy is not finished. The active state is you. And I would defer to everyone at this point to enter into the event stage. If you're already there, stay there. If you're not there yet and you're watching this on stream, check out the Anti-Philosophy Discord, enter into the event stage, and we'll take questions and answers, and we'll have a discussion on what the active state of anti-philosophy is. Let's move forward in this together. I appreciate everyone's time, and I thank you for your attention.